The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we are going to continue with our lecture regarding our aspect of choosing a research design. We had covered other aspects before, and for those of you who haven't been part of the lecture, the first part of this lecture is included down in the description, so that you don't miss out on any of the information as it can be relevant to the information here. Today, we are going to talk about internal and external validity. So let's get started. And of course, we're going to talk about other factors, but primarily, let's talk about internal and external validity. Now, interestingly, we have two forms in which we can understand if something actually measures what it intends to measure. That is what validity is. Validity, in a very basic sense, means, is this valid, right? So for example, a ruler is a valid measure for inches, right? But a thermometer would not be a valid measurement for inches. So that's what we mean by validity. Is this measurement, is this tool, is this construct actually measuring what it is set out to measure, right? You know that thermometers are really reliable, but if I tried to measure inches with a thermometer, it wouldn't be valid, right? So that's what we refer to in a very basic sense of what validity is. Now, we do have different methods in which we can identify that validity in that term. With internal validity, let's talk about that first. We are referring to the extent, to the amount of control so that we can ascertain and determine that we have a single unambiguous explanation for that manipulation. What does that mean? What that means is that I would like to control for as much as possible, right? So that I can be justified in saying my manipulation, my treatment, my independent variable does in fact have a cause and effect. I want to make sure that it is valid. So if I start removing and try to control for those conditions, those experiences, I can with more certainty ascertain my explanation for that manipulation. Therefore, if I can provide that control, I can later say with a certain degree of confidence that my IV had that impact on so my IV had that impact upon my DV. Now, in keeping with our previous examples, for example, in lab, saw that we have the sense of identity and how it can impact depression, right? So we have our factor of identity. And then we have our factor of depression. It's referring to internal because if you notice, I am simply talking about the conditions inside, right? That's why it's called internal. Inside of that research. That's what it means by internal. So if this is my little world of research, I'm trying to make sure that the conditions in here remain valid. On the other hand, we also need to explore the external factors outside of my little research world. That is when external validity comes into play. Now, if we are talking about internal validity, as in the data and the validity within the research, external validity is going to refer, I should say, to that extent of the observations and how am I able to generalize. You take nothing from the term external validity, something you need to remember is generalize. Let's clear this slide. There we go. So internal validity, we're thinking of that research design. We're thinking of those factors within the research. And with external validity, we are referring outside of that research world because I'm trying to generalize the data that I have encountered outside that very specific, that very controlled condition. So I'll give you an example. Say we are conducting a study, and this study is going to involve a new therapeutic technique. And in this therapeutic technique, it's controlled the time of day, the amount of hours of therapy, say what type of exercises, what type of group therapy, right? So I have everything controlled. See, that's inside my little internal world of research. And whatever data I find, I want to make sure that that data can be generalized to the real world client experience, right? That's what external validity refers to. Any questions about internal or external validity? You guys are awesome. See, that's why you guys are getting good grades. Now, remember that we were talking about minimizing and controlling those aspects in order to establish cause and effect. In order to demonstrate that cause and effect, we conduct an experiment. Nothing else. Our correlational study, the thing we're going to conduct is an experiment because it is the only method that can demonstrate cause. It is the only method that can do that for us because of all of the key elements that we control. Because we have so much control, we can, with a certain degree of certainty, decide whether or not that IV and that DV, that IV and that DV actually had that causal link. Or interaction, I should say, let's not get confused with correlations. Now, when I talk about these three key elements, let's talk about first about randomization. Randomization refers both to, number one, how I randomly sample, and number two, how I randomly assign these participants. So what does that mean? For an experiment to be able to demonstrate that cause and effect, I need to control for these three factors. First, randomization. Random sampling, random selection, you may see it referred to in such fashion, is that these individuals that I want to sample from have been selected into my little research portal, have been selected at random. Everybody had that equal opportunity to participate. For instance, Anybody in the institution can be part of my research, or every single graduate student in engineering, right? I'm giving everybody that random chance of being selected. By the same token, once they are selected, I can assign them randomly into that experimental group or that control group. And this is where we are going to move to a second factor, which is manipulation. What do I mean by manipulation? Remember that my IV, that independent variable, so for example, the type of therapy, that medication is manipulated. Whereas my DV is the one that I want to measure. Therefore, in order for me to conduct an experiment, I need the second factor of manipulation. I need to ensure that I indeed have the ability to manipulate, to change as I see fit in order to answer my research question. One of the examples that I like to give is I can control the dosage that you can receive for a medication. That is actually something you can control by milligrams, by times a day. Whereas I wouldn't be able to control manipulating depression. As a participant, you come in with that depression, right? As a participant, you come in with your sex. As a participant, you come in with your race. I cannot manipulate those variables. Therefore, if I don't meet this second criteria, it means it's not an experiment. Just in the same fashion, if I don't meet this first criteria of either randomly selecting or randomly assigning to these different boxes, then I'm not conducting an experiment. Any questions so far? All right, good deal. The last factor that I'd like to discuss that we would need to comply with in order to conduct an experiment is comparison and control. Comparison and control. Very simply put, we are trying to observe if we have one box, as I mentioned earlier, we have one group, we have the group that will receive that medication and the group that will not receive that medication. This here refers to the control group. What do we refer to it as control? Well, if you remember from earlier, if I erase everything here, remember that I want to make sure that the factors within my research remain internally valid. In order for me to do that, I need to ensure that all the conditions except from that IV are the same. So for example, if I have one group and this group is persons from the ages of, let's say, 57, 55, and 75, they are all lower middle class to middle class. All these persons have been diagnosed with depression in the last 5 years. Notice that both groups are going to look the same. Every sort of characteristic that I have is going to look exactly the same, except that compartment of that independent variable. That's why this is control. So I want to manipulate that independent variable. For example, medication. Any questions about that? Good deal. Good deal. Now, when it comes to the structure of that experiment, in regards to that randomization, everybody has an equal chance to participate and also of being assigned to that specific group, whether it is my little experimental or my little control group. And as we stated, random sampling, it's simply that method in which we're going to select a sample at random. So for instance, if I have a group of people, so for example, I have 3,000 people in the county that have been diagnosed with depression within the last 5 years, are between the ages of 55 and 75, are lower to middle class, lower middle class to middle class. I don't want to start selecting a group just so that I can fit my DV. It's like, oh, perfect. This is going to solve. I want to select people specifically because of one characteristic. So this is the guy that I'm going to select. This other guy here is the one that I'm going to select without giving everybody that equal opportunity to be selected for my study. I would actually skew my results specifically. Now, any questions about that? Good deal. Now, interestingly, when it comes to random assignment, as a researcher, you're going to have to account for two specific factors that we will discuss right now. The first factor is those individual differences. So I have a group of people, and I'm going to assign them to my control or my experimental group. But notice that each person is going to have those unique characteristics. And those unique characteristics will indeed differ from one participant to the next. What do I mean? For example, in keeping with our little scenario of these participants, lower middle class, and 55 to 75, each person, even in this room, right? Most people here are young adults between the ages of 18 and 25, right? Those people. People here. Me too, right? Me too. Between the ages of 18 and 25. You guys did know. Even if I keep it very consistent, notice that you will indeed have unique characteristics that make you different from the person sitting right next to you. That could be a problem in regards to random assignment, because even though these characteristics remain the same, for example, all of you share the same race, all of you share the same age, all of you potentially share the same socioeconomic status because you're here on a college campus, right? So notice that unique variability, as we're going to refer to it from now on, could be a problem from random assignment. Because now I have variability that didn't come from my independent variable. Now I have a difference that didn't come from that field. Now I have a difference that didn't come from that medication, right? Now I have a difference that came because every single one of you guys is unique. Look at that, your own little shining star, right? Like a snowflake. There are other issues that we may come across when we're thinking about random assignment, and that is confound, and sometimes you may hear it as confounding variable. This is the importance of this variable, is that it is unanticipated. It is an unanticipated variable that it's generally not even accounted for. Not only that, it could even be impacting your study. You could actually be causing that difference, that cause and effect that you're trying to observe between that DV, that IV and DV. So for instance, in an experiment, we would like to say IV caused DV. But with a confounding variable, what happens is that we are thinking, oh, sure, my IV caused my DV, right? So my therapy caused that decrease of depression. But then there was a confounding variable, a CV. We are thinking, oh, sure, it's headed there. Wait a minute. That's not what caused that measurement that you did with that dB. Generally, it is a variable that we did not anticipate. If it's not anticipated, realize that identifying a confounding variable is immensely difficult. One of the good ways, that might be a little more ahead along the way, but I do want to mention there are means in order to identify confounding variables. For example, you look at previous research and see what happened, right? What were the flaws in that research? So for example, let's say we were not expecting that the time they had breakfast had an impact, and here it is. It did have an impact, so that would be a confounding variable. Right? So previous literature can tell you if there was a confounding variable, something that was a limitation in the study. We gave a medication at 8 in the morning, and we thought because they were taking that medication at 8 in the morning, the DV, my depression, decreased. But it turns out it was a confounding variable, which was how much of a hearty breakfast they had or the time they had breakfast. So it's generally a variable that we do not expect. We cannot, if we cannot expect for it, what can't we do? We can't control for it, can we? Any questions about two issues that could arise that simply you cannot control as a researcher, or both the individual differences or a confounding variable? Good deal. Now let's talk a little bit more in detail about that independent variable. You take nothing else from an independent variable is that it's manipulated. If there's nothing else to remember from an IV, is that it is manipulated. Something interesting is that that independent variable is going to have levels. And I'll show you a brief illustration about that. And these levels remain unchanged between all of my groups. Let's give you an example. Say we have, let's think about, well, sex wouldn't be necessarily a good example, but let's use sex. So, or better yet, let's use another example. So we have the therapy, and therapy is my IV, but notice that that IV is going to have multiple levels. So for example, level 1 will be, let's say, a form of basic therapy. Level 2 is more moderate therapy, and level 3 and so on and so forth can be very long-term therapy. So notice that my IV of therapy, notice that I have multiple levels. Not only that, these levels will remain the same between all of my groups. They will be the same. I'm not going to give the one group just, for example, that level 1 of just basic therapy, and then one group I'm going to give them intensive therapy, right? We would assume that the independent variable will remain unchanged. Those levels will remain unchanged. Similarly, this independent variable is what we presume to be the cause. We presume that this IV has that impact upon my DD. Now, when we refer to a level, we are referring to that specific condition. So for instance, we have the level 1 for therapy for basic, level 2 for more moderate, and then level 3 for more intensive. Now let's talk about my dependent variable. This is the variable that if here we are presuming the cause, and here we are presuming that we're going to have a change because of the presence of that IV. So IV caused that change, caused that impact, right? We use these terms interchangeably, right? And you can. These are the correct terms to use when you are referring to an experiment. This is what we presume to be the effect. Any questions about the characteristics of an independent variable and a dependent variable? Good deal. Good deal. Now, let's say we now understand the different aspects of what we need, the key elements that we need for an experiment, what an IB and a DB is. We ascertain, okay, this is my control group, this is my experimental group, so now it's time to conduct my experiment. Which one should I conduct? Which one should I do? Well, we have these options. We have laboratory experiment and we have field experiments. When we are talking about a laboratory experiment, we are referring to an immensely controlled setting. This is a very extensively controlled setting. Because remember, we want to control and have that internal consistency, that internal, I should say, validity. Because the researcher will have the greatest amount of control over variables. I can, as a researcher within a laboratory setting, I can say, these individuals are going to have these characteristics and they're going to be exposed to these type of conditions. They're going to be exposed to this type of light, to this type of temperature, to this type of seat, in order to say, for example, conduct an assessment. They're all going to receive the same assessment by the same interviewer. So notice that I can control absolutely everything. Or I wouldn't say 100%, but 99%. Because remember, we have that confounding variable, right? The variable we cannot predict. Conversely, we have a laboratory, or I should say a field experiment. Now here, this experiment is going to take place in that environment. So now we're moving outside of the lab, and I want to go, your behavior is in the wild, right? I want to be in that situation and conduct this experiment where you naturally occur, if you will. So notice, I'll give you an example. Say, for whatever reason, I conduct an experiment with persons who have been paroled, right? It's a very different experience doing that in a halfway house where these individuals are paroled, that is there, that will be in the environment where that behavior is occurring naturally, versus having that same parolee in a lab with control conditions. So notice that one, there's multiple benefits for each, but there's also multiple downfalls for each of these aspects. So let's review them. Let's talk about the laboratory experiments. Let's keep in an example where college students were randomly assigned, right? So we need to keep that randomization on check. And they were assigned to exercise with or without a partner. And keep in mind, in a laboratory setting, and the observation, this research took place over the span of 3 weeks. So notice that here we have the no partner condition, which is going to be referring to that control condition. And then we have our next group, as we mentioned, this is going to be by experimental group, because I want to see if having or not having a workout partner will have an impact. So notice that there is no partner condition. So this will be my control. Now, notice that they're going to be exercising within a laboratory setting. So not at your local gym, not at Planet Fitness, not at the on-campus gym. We're going to be conducting this experiment and where I can control other variables such as the time of day that you exercise, the temperature, things of that nature. Now we can move towards a field experiment. And in this case, we would assign you to a specific place that is naturally occurring. Let's say instead of the lab, I'm going to take you to the gym where it would naturally occur. You're a college student, you have access to a college gym. So in this case, in the no partner condition, notice that the student will decide whenever they want to go exercise. Whereas here, he was assigned the condition of exercising within the lab. Conversely, in the randomly assigned condition within that field experiment, they're also deciding when to go exercise. So notice that in this condition, I had much less control, but it was occurring in a natural environment, whereas here I have way more control, but it was occurring in an artificial environment. By the way, that's the term that we generally use, artificial versus natural environment. Any questions about that? Now, in keeping with some of those benefits and downfalls, a great aspect, a great benefit of conducting a study in a laboratory setting is that I can limit the chances of that confounding variable, of mediating variables, of moderating variables to have an impact on that cause and effect interaction. That's one benefit. However, the downfall of a laboratory experiment is that it's immensely artificial, right? Things don't occur in a lab as they would in the real world and vice versa. That is one limitation. In the field experiment, on the other hand, one of the benefits is that I am observing you in the wild. I am observing you as you would normally conduct and go about that naturally occurring behavior or experience or environment or event. That's a good benefit. But the downfall is now I'm going to have less control. Now I'm going to have less certainty that it was that peer, that partner working out with you, that motivated you into working out versus anything else. Maybe you absolutely love the college gym. It had nothing to do with your workout partner, right? Maybe it had nothing to do with it. It's just like, oh, I like the gym here. Or, maybe it's there's that gal or that guy that always works out on Thursdays. Like, I'm gonna go to that gym. So you weren't even working out because of your partner. Now we had a confounding variable, which is, oh, I like Becky. She always works out here, so I'm gonna work out here. It had nothing to do with your partner. So any questions about a lab versus a field occurring experiment? Good deal. Now, there are some issues. There are some issues in which when we are assigning people, there are some ethical issues with that. Let's talk about the random assignment. Let's talk about random assignment. As we mentioned, in the random assignment, you're going to ensure that all of those participants have an equal chance of being assigned to a specific group. The issue is that for this group, they will be receiving whichever the benefits or risk or cost are associated with that group. And this is very important because you as a researcher will have to demonstrate the benefits and cost of me being a research participant. Not only that, assigning me to a specific group. And I think we might have covered this before, but I like using this example. In keeping on this therapy, right? We have the therapy and we're going to measure depression. And we have level 1, basic, level 2, moderate, and level 3, intensive therapy as defined, as you would define it in your research. So remember, I have a control group that is not going to be what? It's not going to be assigned to that treatment. It's not going to be assigned to that medication. It's not going to be assigned to that factor that I am manipulating. One can argue that it's unethical because keep in mind, Peter over here, who was part of my experimental group, who is in fact receiving one of those modalities, whether it be basic therapy, moderate or intensive, Peter's receiving the benefit from that intervention, from that IV. Sarah, on the other hand, is part of the control. She is not receiving the benefits of that intervention, i.e. therapy, pills, things of that nature. That could be an ethical concern because now there wasn't that equal chance of having those benefits. By the same token, Peter, who is receiving the therapy, is consuming the costs and the risks that come from being part of this new treatment modality or this new pill, whatever the case. So notice that there is ethical concerns for both of those assignments, right? One is perhaps not experiencing the benefits. One is perhaps experiencing the cost. Any questions about that? Good deal. Interestingly, it may not be sufficient when we have one group that obviously has greater benefits than the other, which can in turn lead us to compensate that disadvantaged group. And how do we compensate? How do we compensate Sarah that is not receiving that therapy, that is not receiving that intervention, that IV? Well, we're going to compensate that person with that equalization of treatment. So for instance, like in keeping with our example, we have this new treatment modality. Let's give it a name. Let's see, the green treatment modality. Modality 1, right? The green treatment. Peter is receiving that green treatment because I want to see if that so-called green treatment, this new therapeutic intervention, is going to assist or better serve this specific population in which Peter belongs in, I should say. Remember that Sarah is not getting that treatment. Ethically, I am obligated to therefore provide some form, I should say, of compensation. For instance, I can say, Peter is going to receive this brand new treatment that we are developing. So for example, let's say medication. So Peter is going to be exposed to this new medication, benefits and costs of this medication. But then with other groups, we can later explain, you're going to be provided with, say, for example, an older method. So for instance, X medication that we already know has an impact on depression. So notice that it's not equal, but we're trying to level that field ethically. Any questions about the risk or cost associated by random assignment? Good deal. Good deal. Now, we were talking about internal validity. Notice that there are threats, there are issues that may arise when you're trying to keep that internal valid research world, when you're trying to keep those conditions controlled. There are some issues that could arise because of naturally occurring events. So for instance, let's talk about history effects. Right? What do I mean by history effects? There are some issues when we are referring to history, because there could be literally aspects that are developing at the same time that you are conducting your study that will, in fact, impact your participant. So for example, the participants you are, say for example, the participant you were before COVID is likely not going to be the same participant after COVID, because this is a historical event, right? Persons, as you know, recently we had the remembrance of 9/11. Children during that time were very different before that time than the children that grew up during 9/11. So notice that historical events, right, will have an impact. And some of them is actually pretty interesting, like post 9/11 babies tend to think about aspects of security more. They're used to TSA, they're used to all these different security measures, whereas us that were on the little older side, we actually lived in the world that TSA wasn't as strict. So notice that my response to certain things in that research world could indeed be impacted by historical facts. Let's talk about maturation. When we are thinking about maturation, let's think about how you as a participant, have physiological, psychological aspects that change over time during a study. You are maturing, if you will. But what do I mean by that? Say, for example, even in short term, you don't even need to think about a longitudinal study where time has gone by extensively. Something even as simple as a change of semester. Last year you were a freshman, this next semester you're a sophomore. Notice that both your psychological and physical aspects have changed throughout the study. If we start our research this semester and finish it during the next academic year, you are not the same person. Because of that, if we keep in par with those internal unique characteristics, just like you come with your unique characteristics, you're also developing, right? Physically, psychologically. So if you ask yourself, most of you guys are either juniors or seniors. I want you to think about when you graduated high school. Well, a lot of you don't want to remember how that looked like. See a couple heads like cringe, bless you. Because you have changed physically and psychologically. I know at least when I was in high school, I was super ugly. Super. Look at me now. Hey, right? So I know that someone have given me, if I was a participant back then, right, for self-image, right, person that I am today would respond differently because of simple process of becoming more mature. Any questions about that? Right. The next thing that could be a threat, that could impact that perfect controlled world of that internal validity within your research is testing effects. We have very few rules, very few laws in psychology, and this is probably one of the few that we have. Generally, it means that you have an improved performance in a test because you have been exposed to it. You have the experience of taking that test. That's one of the few laws that we have in psychology. Chances are, because you have already taken a test, it is likely that there will be a difference when you take that second exam. Even if you didn't study, even if you didn't do anything, even if there's nothing different, what was different is the experience, the actual experience of taking that test. Think about the test that you guys just took, all right? Say you got an 89. If I were to give you the same test, say next Sunday, chances are you're not going to get an 89. And you didn't study differently, you didn't review slides, you didn't come to office hours, chances are that because of that testing effect, your response will be different. Which is why, sometimes when people take tests like licensure or like driver's license, things of that nature, they usually give you a second chance because it increases that chance that you will perform better. The problem is, because that is a naturally occurring thing, chances are that you will perform better. Notice that now I cannot justify that my IV was what led to that change, was what led to that better, in performing better. Any questions about that? Good deal. Fantastic. This was really interesting. Now, when we are talking about the threat of regression towards the mean, I want you to think about a perfect, beautiful Bell distribution. Right? Let's see how I do this time. Oh no, right. There we go. So this here in the very center is going to represent that mean. So this is going to represent that mean. Notice that generally we will regress back to that. Generally, as a participant, we are going to go back to whatever that measurement was. So for example, say you're given that treatment and now you're performing way better. Say for example, you have less depression and you're somewhere around here, right? You're doing better. The issue is that we are naturally inclined to move back towards that average. There's a reason why it's called average, because it is typical, it is common, right? So normally, if you are right here, that's you right there, looks just like you. Generally, we will have that tendency of our data going back to whatever this average was. This is a problem because if you have scored unusually high or unusually low, say for example, now you're way up here, you're doing so great with your depression. So here we go, bigger smile, look at that. Now you're doing super great because it was an unusually high or unusually low score. You could potentially regress back, go back towards the mean, towards your average amount of depression. For example, right, amongst other things. Now, let's move towards another threat of back validity. Let's move to another threat. That is the instrument and the measurement that we are utilizing. So let's think about how am I going to measure your depression, right? So I use this one specific assessment tool called the Dr. Shah's depression inventory, right? The issue is that there could have been an error between the first time you were assessed with the Dr. Shah's inventory versus the second time. So for instance, when you become my participant, before I give you this medication, I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to do this assessment so we can compare. Remember, pre-test, post-test, right? Pre-exposure of that treatment, and then we're going to conduct a measurement post-test, right? Post-intervention, right? So I give you the Fisher's inventory for depression and say it goes 1 to 100, 100 is super depressed, 0 is no depression. And we give you this assessment and say you score 70, right? You're up there with your depression. But then I give you that medication, and then I observe you for however long with this medication. And remember, it's controlled, right? Because that's the point of an experiment. And then say 6 months after that, I'm like, okay, let's give you Dr. Shar's depression inventory again, so we can measure if there was an impact from this independent variable. But notice if there was an error of measurement, right? So for example, there's something wrong with Dr. Shar's assessment, there was some error in, say, me conducting that interviews, for example, an error that came from me, an error that comes from you. Example, not understanding the questions correctly this time, being confused about the questions, and you're a little bit hungover, and then there's an issue with the assessment and you can't read it too well, a little tipsy tips. So notice that now there is an error generally associated with the actual text, the items. And if you remember from our lab, right, we did talk about that because we were talking about how can we eliminate or confirm that certain items, right? For example, in your lab for models, things due, did I make that up? Thursday. See, you got my tag to think for us. It was me was due the day of the exam. So just say thanks to her. She's the one that's keeping you guys, you know, chill. Oh, the day of the exam. All right. Any questions about these potential threats? Good deal. Outstanding. Outstanding. Now, we also have other threats. This is what we like to call attrition or experimental mortality, which just sounds too metal, you know? I think this should be like the name of an album, experimental mortality. You know, you're not ready for this. I feel like this should be, but either way, enough about me and my metal taste. This is when a participant does not show up, or they simply fail to complete it. Why is this a problem? Right, that participant, that experimental mortality. Let's think about that example that I gave you guys. I recruited you as freshmen, I should say, and I'm going to conduct this depression experiment. I'm going to observe you for the next 4 or 5 years. If I started with, say, 1,000 people, and then towards the end, I have 700 people, that data will inherently be different. First of all, because the sample is smaller. You know, bigger the sample. And research bigger is better, right? So we do want more participants. Unless, of course, it's a qualitative research, in which case less is better. But notice that because of that participant mortality, if you will, as I'm going to refer to it, notice that that data is now inherently different. Not only that, let's say within those 1,000 participants, somebody moves, somebody dies, somebody says, I want to be part of this. It is their right? As we mentioned with ethical concerns previously in other lectures, it is your right to withdraw consent at any point. They have the right to do that. They don't have to stay in that research. Fortunately, now that's going to be a threat to my study. Now, interestingly, we can go a little bit deeper into that attrition problem because sometimes that rate of attrition will be different between one group and the other group of the study. For instance, we can think about it in many ways. For example, I have 1,000 participants, 500 will receive the therapy approach, the therapeutic approach, the new one, the breathe therapy, and then the other 500 do not. And all of a sudden, I see that the attrition in my control is like, maybe 10 of 75. Whereas in my experimental group, I start seeing 60 out of 75. So notice that the rates of them leaving, not being part of the study, is different. Right? It could be, say, for example, racial makeup. Say more of my white Caucasian participants decide come out compared to, say, another group. So, for example, Black or African American. Right? It could be many different aspects. Now, one of the last factors that I want to talk about in terms of threats, it's environmental factors. I want you to think about the study itself. There are things about the study that you will not like, whether it be the actions, for example, the actions of the researcher. Now, think, for example, the only way this can occur is because it is different. My actions in each level are different. So I'll give you an example. Say in level 1 of my therapy, level 2 and level 3, say that in level 1 as basic, I use a very soft tone of voice. All right. And then for my moderate therapy, I'm using soft again. What if in my intensive level of therapy, I start yelling or raising my voice? Notice that now I cannot justify that the change in intervention was because of the level, because now I included this factor, yelling. That doesn't make it. Remember, all these levels have to remain the same. So now, as a researcher, I included another variable, another aspect that could be impacting that measurement of that dependent variable and in regards to the manipulation of my IV. Now, in keeping with external validity, what are the threats? So before we were talking about threats within that research. And remember, external validity refers to how much I can extend, how much can I generalize the info that I have, how much am I able to generalize that result to that population that I'm trying to serve, that population that I'm trying to look into. First and foremost, one of the first threats will be population validity. Simply put, is that extent in which the results that you observe and had in your study will indeed generalize to that population. Now, the issue with that generalization is that we may have a sample, right, that remains the same, right? That we're not seeing those changes that we were expecting because we are indeed imparting this independent variable, this treatment, this intervention, right? You hear these terms interchangeably. That's why I keep repeating them, of course. We also have ecological ability. This is when we are trying to see whether or not there is that extent in which the study, that result will extend across several types of settings or environments. What does that mean? Well, let's think about this. Say this new treatment modality, I am imparting it in a, let's say, CBT setting, cognitive behavioral therapy setting. And I am doing this in a community college university setting. But now, what would happen if I'm trying to generalize that same info that I found with my students going to therapy, and I observe them from freshman through up until graduation? What would happen if I tried to generalize, say, instead of a counseling center in a college setting, now I want to use this treatment morality in a counseling center for drug abuse? Will this information be able, can we generalize to this different type of environment, to this different type of setting? Any questions about that? Good deal. You guys are fantastic. Let's talk about temporal validity. As the term suggests, we are wondering if my results in my study will be able, if I will be able to generalize those results across different points in time. So think about the example that I gave you about children, for example, your parents who did not grow up in the post 9/11 era. And say I have conducted the same study with your parents between they were freshmen, they graduated, treatment modality, same treatment modality. And we find out, yes, this treatment modality works. But what would happen if I'm trying to look at that same treatment modality and now I'm looking into a different point in time? All right, so for example, we're thinking about 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and now we have the 2010s babies, have millennials, older millennials, centennials, boomers. So would this information be applicable to that other point in time? Interestingly, I know we talk about just one dependent variable, right? And in today's class, we talked about depression. But interestingly, we also want to look into outcome. So sure, we want to find out if our results generalize to depression towards the population, but we also want to look into, I wonder if this information can be generalized to yet other aspects of related DVs. So let's think about depression, right? We know that some aspects of depression can involve companionship, loneliness. In your study that we conducted in lab, you saw there was an impact. There was some variance between that identity and depression. But you'll also see in your lab and real life that there are other dependent variables related to identity. For example, gender identity. Persons, and this is a known fact, persons who identify as non-cisgender can have increased susceptibility to depression. Not only that, the increased rate or likelihood for suicide is also greater. For example, we can see variable of depression. What about the variable of anxiety? What about the variable of loneliness? What about the variable of SIV, self-injurious behavior, SI, suicidal ideation, HI, homicidal ideation, right? So I would expect that my results, what is the extent that they can relate to other related variables? And in your lab, I believe we have 4, right? So we have depression, have positive, negative, 5, we have 5. So notice I would expect that that sense of identity related to other variables of that same fashion. That is what outcome validity refers to. Lastly, we have mundane realism. Mundane realism. Now, interestingly, whenever we are conducting this research, we want to set up perhaps an environment that looks or resembles that of the real world that I am trying to investigate. I'm trying to simulate that naturally occurring behavior. So if you remember, we talked about how lab studies tend to be artificial. So now we're going to have that mundane realism. Similarly, we're going to have experimental realism. We're moving a little bit outside of that physical setting. We're moving towards that psychological setting, which is, does it feel real for that participant? So for instance, if I am doing therapy in a lab, right, it would look very different from the therapy that I do, say, at a rehab clinic. But the point of that researcher in the lab is to try to resemble as close as possible that environment, but yet still controlled because it's still a laboratory and it's still an experiment. Trying to mimic and resemble that naturally occurring environment because I'm trying to make it look less artificial. I'm trying to limit the limitations that we talked about earlier of the fact that a laboratory experiment is highly artificial. So I'm trying to do away with that artificial impact. Any questions about that? Now, in summary, from what we have discussed both in our previous lecture and this lecture, notice that the goal of you as a researcher of behavioral sciences, let's think about counseling, let's think about sociology, think about social work, psychology. The goal of doing research specifically in these type of fields is so that we can advance of knowledge of those behaviors and the events that are involved in our clients or in that population. Very simply put, the research that you conduct, the intent is to serve that population. How is this research going to be relevant in saying, how can I assist persons with depression? How can I assist persons with anxiety? How can I assist practitioners that are struggling with providing therapy or conducting research? The intent is for that to extrapolate and translate into the accumulation of knowledge so that we can better serve those people. Now, at the undergraduate level, that is difficult to view perhaps, but everything you're doing right now, including this class, is what that intent that you will serve a population. By the same token, you as an ethical and educated researcher, you need to understand what are the limitations of said research. To advance knowledge, you will need to choose an appropriate method, an appropriate research design. If you're not choosing the appropriate method, chances are you won't be able to expand on that knowledge accurately or appropriately. You need to be aware of what the limitations are for each research design that we have covered in our previous lectures. Correlations, experiments, quantitative, qualitative research. You need to understand both its strengths and weaknesses when drawing conclusions. You don't want to make the mistake, say, for example, in a correlation, and not understanding that the limitation of a correlation is we can establish cause. But then when you're conducting research, you can say there's a correlation between lack of sleep and increased symptoms of depression. You don't want to say lack of sleep causes depression. That is beyond the benefits and extent of that specific research design that you pick, which is a correlation. Any questions about that? Fantastic. And that will be the end of our lecture.